Hi, I'm Danny Bradbury and this is The Register. Now, desktop virtualization, you may think you've got it nailed. You've got VDI down, you've avoided boot storms by putting fiber channel on your SAN, you've got all your users bought in, you've made sure that everything's personalized. But have you thought about licensing for virtual desktops and applications? It's an area where many people get tripped up. Well, I'm here in sunny Folsom, California to see Dave Buchholz of Intel. Now Dave's got a really interesting angle on this. He deals with vendors and he also deals with customers, Intel customers, and he deals with his own internal users. And he has to keep everyone happy while also extolling the benefits of desktop virtualization. Many different models, many different approaches. Here's Dave to tell you about it. So is licensing really a problem when it comes to virtualizing the desktop?
Yes and no. Desktop virtualization has been around for a while. It's solving some existing problems. It's helping alleviate some pain points inside of IT shops today. So it's not necessarily a problem, but it is creating some new problems that we haven't seen in the past. Number one, storage in the back end, when you start talking about SANs and everything else, cost a lot more than storage on the front end today. Network infrastructure, but also in the area of licensing. It's bringing to light, multiple uses of licenses. In some cases you have licenses being used in the main OS and then in the virtualized OS on the same platform. So are you really using two licenses? Are you using it, two at the same time? So it brings all these new models that IT shops haven't had to think about before. So in today's models, what you usually have is you have your client that looks like this. And then in that client you usually have one layer that's like your operating system. You have another layer which is usually like your applications. Another layer which is usually your data. And then your final layer is what we like to call user settings. So, whatever the user's environment is what usually sits up here. Most of your licensing is actually in these two layers right here. You pay a single license, usually one, for your OS layer. And then your application layer you have, infinite number of licenses that you buy depending on the application stacks and everything else you support. It's a pretty predictable model today because based on the number of these devices that you have here, what that licensing model is going to do. But where that really begins to change is when you start introducing virtualization. Because when you look at virtualization, it can add a whole bunch of different layers to it. Now when you look at a client, it may not just be one OS. You may have your OS like you have today as your base OS. But on top of that OS, you can draw a line through here and say you have your traditional apps like we've done before. You may have data and user settings. So you might have licensing here and you have licensing here. But on top of this you may have another OS. Maybe it's a type 2 virtualization, XP mode, MedV, something like that. And within this OS layer you also have another set of apps that might run. So you have licenses that can be here and you have licenses that can be here. Add to that, you may have something as simple as an RDP client. And that RDP client is actually going to a back-end server location that you're paying for an OS license here and application licenses here. So you have more licenses that you're doing here. You may have, even within this virtualized OS, maybe you have an RDP session, which also points back to this. So all this model starts getting more and more blurry because literally you go from that one model of understanding completely what you're doing, that depending on what the user is doing and where these licensing models tend to go, you may provide one service through RDP, you might provide another through application virtualization. Maybe your apps, instead of being delivered rich natively in the future on top of the OS, just come down through application streaming. And so is the app really running here? Is it running in the back end? Are you remote displaying the device? So this whole model starts to blow up. You can see where all these licensing models start to blow up because it's not such a predictable footprint anymore. It really doesn't matter how many of these devices you have anymore, because each model could be completely different. So now what it really comes down to is how is your application being delivered, and that endpoint that uses it is really going to not have such an input on it. It's really going to be down licensing the service itself as it comes down, and that's really what's going to change, because now you have to look at how many people can concurrently access that in the back end at the same time versus how many devices I've deployed. On the virtually hosted desktop side, IT shops really like the attractiveness of being able to centrally manage an image and all this other stuff, but the employees are demanding richer and richer computing front ends. And so you're seeing technologies come out from vendors like Citrix and VMware that allow remote computing to be pushed down to the device. In other words, depending on how rich an environment you want, if the device can support it with a CPU and GPU at the endpoint, the computing, instead of being done all in the back end, some of it can be pushed to the front end. And so you're really getting a virtually hosted, centrally managed image that literally can do some computing at the endpoint. So it's kind of this transitional computing state. So some of these are still in flux, which is causing IT shops to take pause again and really start to look. But the key comes down to IT shops have to look at their user segments and figure out what user segments could best benefit from what kind of technology.
Isn't it just the fact that Intel wants to sell as many chips to desktop users as it can, so it doesn't want everyone moving their desktops to the server?
Don't get me wrong, there's going to be use cases within Intel that VDI makes sense to do. The difference is it's our end users won't be happy with it. So we've gone off and we've done the studies, we've published white papers on the use cases and everything else. And the problem is when you do traditional virtually hosted desktop, everything's done in the back end. Everything's locked down. If you look at our model that we have in here, again, we're over an 80% mobile company. Most of our users today have full administrative rights on their system. If you take them now to a model of the traditional VHD, which is everybody's pulled into an environment in the back end, their rights are completely locked down, everything else, it's not a rich computing environment. They don't get the full graphics. They can't, good luck trying to watch even a video in that space, right? It doesn't go to the model they're used to today. And so they are, quote, less productive.
With so many models to choose from in desktop virtualization, is it any wonder that people are getting themselves into such a mess?
Exactly it. Well, and then add to that the emerging model of, environments between devices starting to be able to talk to each other and stuff and be able to cut out the back end sometimes. And so, we're not just talking about accessing services delivered from a back end. Sometimes you may access a service from another device, and is there going to be a licensing implication of using a service from one device? Say you have a laptop in the future that's been issued by your company. Your company allows you to use, quote, exposed services off that device onto your personal device. So nothing ever really sits on your personal device, but you're accessing that environment from your device. Does that have a licensing implication? We don't know, right? Can you do something as simple as you've got your laptop system running today, maybe instead of running a VHD environment where you put it in the back end, maybe we allow you through your tablet to connect via VNC or something like that type of service back to your laptop. Is there a licensing implication there? This whole world's getting really cloudy when it comes to the whole licensing because these models are just being sliced up even more and more. And that's the problem is the vendors are just now getting caught up to where we were probably 3 or 4 years ago.
What are the vendors doing to make desktop virtualization licensing easier?
In some cases, the vendors themselves are helping to push the industry, but in some cases you're dealing with a virtualization vendor in some cases that is developing an architecture and a solution that utilizes another vendor's product. And so they can help create technology that solves this, but you still ultimately got to go back to the software vendor that you're using and have their software licensing models adapt to your new usage models. We've seen that with a lot of the industry. A lot of the major tools, so on and so forth, are starting to dovetail into this. And it could be things like Microsoft and stuff like this have their own virtualization tool sets now. So they're starting to move their own tools, and so they kind of tend to bring the rest of the industry along with them. But there are still some limited use tool sets that we see out there that haven't really started going the way of acknowledging that virtualization is not just a small trend, but it's a mega trend, and that it's starting to come into the industry.
So what can IT managers do to develop a strategy to make desktop virtualization licensing easier?
It comes down to a couple things, I think. When I've talked to other folks in the industry, other IT shops I work with on a partner basis, and it seems everybody's got the same type of approach. The first thing they look at is, number one, what are the types of apps I'm trying to, quote, virtualize, and why am I trying to virtualize them right now? Am I trying to virtualize my apps because I think I can get better manageability out of them, better accountability for who's actually using the apps and stuff like that? It's great ideas, right? But it comes down to what are the apps I actually want to do? Are you trying to do a $3,000 per license engineering app, or are you really trying to do your Office suite? And because both of those have different ramifications. If you're trying to do a $3,000 per license engineering app, you're trying to save money, right? And you're trying to centralize it. You want to go concurrent licensing. There's a lot of things you want to do because you don't want to go out and spend thousands and thousands of dollars on extra licenses if you can centralize it, virtualize it, and all these other things. So there's a different thing that pushes in on the IT shop to be able to do that. But in the end, if you're really just trying to simplify your software distribution method and say, my standard Office suites, these other things, then you got to ask yourself a question of, do I have a site license? Do I have an EA or an SA with the vendor? If I have those, I'm not necessarily looking at trying to manage my licensing stack as much. I'm using it simply to reduce my IT footprint, lower my distribution costs, my maintenance that has to go into it. If it's something I don't have an ERSA, then you're also doing the same thing as what you're trying to do for an engineering tool set. You're looking at it. And so all those things go into the equation, and the IT CIO has got to figure out, answer those questions, and it helps them select what kind of tool they need to be able to do this. Because some tools are very good at managing that license back end and telling you who's actually using something in your environment. You've deployed it to 120,000 machine, maybe only 13,000 people have ever launched it in the last year. That's something that's valuable. If you have an EA or an SA, that data is still valuable, but maybe it's not as critical right now. And so maybe you go for a different solution that allows you to roll it out faster, and you worry about building the actual data gathering and license management piece down the road.
How aligned are vendors in terms of dealing with licensing desktop virtualization? Is Microsoft in alignment with the various Linux vendors, for example?
I think realistically, so today they're still kind of disconnected. You have different vendors going after different solutions. I think what you really see, though, is you see a couple of vendors evolving into where I think it's going to make sense for an IT shop, and that is they're becoming, quote, infrastructure companies. They're not trying to provide, quote, a solution stack that only runs on, quote, my environment, right? They're evolving instead into trying to deliver an infrastructure in the back end that can go out to multiple OSs. Right, you've seen this with Microsoft. They come out with Silverlight. They've come out with a lot of these other tool sets now that are actually be propagating out to Linux and Android and all these other tools, or other operating systems that are out there. And you see that from other vendors as well. Citrix has done the same thing. VMware's doing the same thing with a lot of their tool sets as well. So you see several vendors in the industry trying to provide, quote, an infrastructure, and that's because they know that there's going to be multiple OSs in the future. And so how do you support those, without trying to, take the approach of saying everything has to run in my farm?
It seems then that we've come a long way from the 90s, when there was really only one operating system in town for enterprise users. With the number of devices and operating systems exploding, will operating system and application software companies as we know them cease to exist?
It'll exist, it just won't look like it does today, right? It's a natural evolution. So as IT shops are having to evolve, as the end users are pushing evolution, when we're talking about computing evolution, the software vendors, to, quote, stay ahead of the game, to stay relevant, and to provide environments that people want to use, both in the consumer and the professional world, are going to have to evolve. Most of them arguably are doing it today. They're already doing it on the consumer side. When you start looking at, whether it's something as simple as like Google Apps or Microsoft Live or some of these other services that are coming out, right? It's kind of funny that they're doing it for the consumer side already, but the corporate side, it's not quite yet ready for it yet, right? Because the corporate side, we have different set of rules and regulations and everything else. But the consumer side, they already see the play in that space. So they're evolving already. It's just it's a matter of time before it evolves into a niche fit that makes the IT shops feel a little bit better.